Good evening. My name, as you can see, is Kheya Ganguley-Kiefner, and I am a Senior Qualitative Analyst here at Statistics Solutions. So I spend my day working and playing with qualitative data. I've been doing it for about 15 or so years. As we're going through the presentation, if you have questions, please type them in, and I will fit the question in as I'm talking. So what we're going to do is cover the different stages of qualitative analysis, how to decide what methodology you want to use, what are the strengths of each different type of methodology, what are the weaknesses. A lot of it really will depend on what you're trying to learn. Your research questions, just like any other study, will determine exactly what you want to know and how you want to know it. So the first characteristics that you need to remember when you're thinking or considering about doing qualitative study. First of all, it is an inductive methodology. Typically, when you think of studies, people think of, you're going to do research, you're going to have a hypothesis, you're going to try to prove or disprove it. You're going to be Sherlock Holmes. That's deductive. Inductive means you're going to gather the information and you're going to get your answer by going through the data that you've gathered. So it's arising from the data rather than presupposing what might happen. It's simultaneous, which means that as you're gathering your data, you're also doing your analysis. You're also starting to pull threads together. The strength in this is the fact that as you're getting the data and analyzing it, you may see avenues that you want to pursue further or places that you didn't realize you needed to question, so you can add that in as you go along. It's naturalistic, which means you're observing people in their natural habitat. So you're not trying to put people in a laboratory and isolate them. Their context is just as important as what they're saying. And finally, it's interpretive. You are searching or trying to make meaning from data. You're not trying to answer a yes or no question. You're not trying to say, if I do A, B will happen. You're trying to explore a phenomenon, interpret what it means, and come to results from using that. Okay, so when you're analyzing qualitative data, it's a simultaneous and iterative process, which means that a bunch of things happen at once. You almost have to be a juggler. And you're going to almost go in a snake-like circle because you keep going back and forth in through your data and your collection because each piece informs the other. Your first step is collecting data. There are many, many ways of collecting qualitative data. A few most popular: interviews, and we'll talk about different types in a moment, field notes, scanned material. So interviews. Generally, when you're looking at doing a qualitative study, you either want to use an unstructured or semi-structured interview. Unstructured means you're going to go in there with a general idea of what your topic is and what you're trying to learn about, but you're not necessarily going to have specific questions. The strength to this is you can follow your participants' lead, so go where they're taking you to really explore the data. The weakness of this method is that you can actually lose your way and not get the information you need. A semi-structured interview, which is the most commonly used interview, is where you create a series of questions before you start doing any interviews. These questions link back to your research questions, so you know that you will be asking questions that'll get you the data you need. And they're formulated so they're open-ended. You don't want to ask yes or no questions, and you don't want to ask three-part questions like, do you like eating ice cream? Yes, I do. Why? That can interrupt thought. It's better to ask questions such as, tell me how you feel about ice cream. And then people start talking like, I love ice cream, I hate ice cream, and you can keep prompting them to go on to get a lot of detail. The other advantage to a semi-structured interview is you have a set of questions you will ask each participant. So you know that you're going to get a little bit of sort of standardization, even though you don't necessarily need that qualitative studies. But it enables you to really sit there and say, okay, I've asked the same question to my 10 participants. Let's see how they've all answered it. Field notes. This is super important. One of the things that people don't necessarily do well is this part of the qualitative analysis, the interview and the field notes. Field notes should be a list of all of your thoughts, the reasons why you made the decisions or choices you did during your study, what occurred during your study, what you've observed during your interview. Every detail that you can think of should be in your field notes. One for a couple, well, there's a couple different reasons. The first one is you're going to use as part of your analysis. You may be putting down observations like they laughed a lot or they seemed uncomfortable. The other part of it is to make your study more reliable, what we call issues of trustworthiness. If someone ever wanted to replicate your study or see how you did it, or IRB wanted to do an audit, they could go to your field notes and see everything you did. So it's really important to keep really good notes. Going back and touching on the interviews, remember to spend your time here. This is your data. If you rush an interview, you're not going to have the data you need to answer your research questions. A good qualitative interview lasts generally anywhere from a half an hour to an hour and a half, depending on your topic. So not only do you want to ask your questions, but if someone says something and you're not sure what they meant or you need clarification, you need to probe into it. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Tell me more about it. I'm not sure I understood what you said. And then what happened? How did that make you feel? Those are all examples of probes you can use to pull out more information from your participants. Scanned material can be anything. It can be documentation, it can be photographs, it can be anything that was written. Pretty much, if it has words, it's something you can analyze in a qualitative manner. So you've got your data. What happens next? If you've done interviews and recorded them, you're going to get them transcribed or you're going to transcribe them yourself. Once that's done, you're going to start reading your data. Part of this process is, and it does sound strange, but you want to read and read and read and reread till you almost have it memorized. You want to sink into that data so you have a good feeling of what people are saying. And you'll find as you do this, you're going to see patterns emerging. You're going to see people using certain words and phrases over and over again. You may start seeing connections between different interviews. Once you've done that, the next step is to code the data. I'm going to get into this in more detail later, but briefly what you do is you start identifying text fragments. It could be a word, a phrase, a sentence, or even a paragraph that means something. You're going to assign a code or a series of words to that set of data. The word should be created in such a way that just by looking at the code, you have a good idea of what's in there. You wouldn't have to look at the raw data. You could tell by the code what this means. Once you've done that, you're going to code for description. You're going to look for descriptive text and quotes that you can use while you're writing up your results. Once you've coded all your data, you're going to organize it. Generally what I do is I try to group things together into clumps of things that are similar. And I keep doing that until I can't organize it anymore and I've reduced it to the fewest number of clumps of information. And that's where you get your theme. And that's what you're going to, that's your results. That's what you're going to be talking about in reporting in Chapter 5, 4, and discussing in Chapter 5. So let's talk about the different types or most popular types of qualitative analysis or methodology. Case studies are really popular. They are the study of one or more cases bounded by a uniting factor. What does that mean? It means that you are going to be able to actually identify and define what your case is. You're going to be able to say that this entire group of people or this situation is a case. It might be an elementary school, could be a case. It could be a second grade classroom, could be a case. Maybe it's a gifted classroom. You have to be able to define what it is in words. Okay? They have to be bound by something that pulls them together. Case studies are usually examined over time, so you can get an in-depth analysis. So it's not generally an in-and-out kind of study. You're looking to answer how and why questions when you're doing a case study. The other mark that you're looking at is that the context that the phenomenon you're studying is so intertwined with the participants, you can't separate them. So if you have someone that's, and again, a school system can be really good looking at teachers in a school system, what they do is really determined by where they are. So they're embedded in that place. So that would be a very good example to use for a case. Now here's something that's really important, and I see people not consider this. You cannot do a case study if you don't have multiple types of data and data collection. Simply doing interviews is not enough to conduct a case study. For example, you're going to want interviews. You're going to want, maybe if you're doing the school, let's say, you're going to want attendance reports because you're studying attendance. You want disciplinary reports because you're studying discipline. You may want grades. You want the student handbook. You're going to want a focus group with administrators. You're trying to get as many data points as you can to get as much information as you can so you can describe your case. It generates very rich description because you have so many types of data. The goal of the case study, again, is to come up with themes that emerge that can describe that case. Understand that case studies are not as generalizable. You're really looking at something in a specific place and time. So what you're trying to do is answer a question or a problem based on what that case needs. Phenomenology. Now, I am going to talk briefly about this. I will tell you, if you have more questions about phenomenology, please feel free to ask questions or email, because there are many different types. And depending on what you're trying to do, you may prefer one type over another. Okay. The goal of phenomenology is to explore the lived experience of the participants. In other words, we want to know what the people in our study have actually experienced and perceived about whatever we're studying. We want their words, their viewpoint, their biases. We want to know what they were thinking, feeling, smelling, tasting, whatever it might be, in as much detail as possible, so that we can look across our participants and say, okay, so they each have their own experiences, but across them, here are the commonalities or the themes. We're really looking to describe the meaning that they find in their experiences. And like I said, you're looking for the commonalities, but you're also looking for the differences, because those can be important. What you're really trying to do is get into this data and get into this information you gather and come up with the very essence that describes the phenomenon. What that means is you want to be able to take all the data you get from the interviews and distill it down to the point where you have a solid piece or description that can illuminate something new about whatever you're studying. For example, let's say you're studying how African American men in the inner city who go to college are successful. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be just talking about their experiences. And again, lived experience is an important term. It's past tense. You're looking into the past to see what's affecting them today. So you're not doing a study of what's going to happen in the future, or not even necessarily what's going on at this moment. You're looking at what experiences have led to this moment. So for this group of people, you're going to be probably talking to them about high school, about their parents, about their family, what influences, what helped them succeed, and you're going to get their stories. And you're going to use those stories to come up with your themes. The one thing to remember with phenomenology, your questions have to be very open-ended. You really don't want more than, at the very most, probably 8. And that's a lot. You should have like a solid 5 or 6 questions that are wide enough that you can ask prompts off of them. Typically, you expect for each question, someone's going to talk for 10 to 20 minutes. So think about that. If you're asking someone 6 questions, you're asking them to talk for 2, they could be talking for 2 hours. So you have to be very careful when you're doing this. Grounded theory. This is the work of Glaser and Strauss, came up in 1967. Grounded theory is a really interesting method to use. The goal of this study is to create a theory that explains the phenomenon you are studying. It's emergent and it's dynamic. What does that mean? When you're doing a grounded theory study, you are conducting rounds of interviews. You find out what you want to learn about. For Glaser and Strauss, they did a study of hospice care and death and dying. So they went in and they talked to all the nurses and doctors. And they came back to look at their data. They analyzed it and said, okay, so this is what we found out. But we didn't learn anything about this, this, and this, and 5 people talked about it. So they went in and did a second round of interviews, specifically on those points. They came back, they analyzed their data. They said, okay, now this is a new avenue. They went back and interviewed again. At that point, they felt they had enough data and enough information that they could explain that process or action and the interactions that these people had with their patients and how they help people in hospice care with end-of-life issues. And based on that, they were able to create a theory. So you can see they talked to many people to get this information. what's really interesting is you can find some very new information out by using grounded theory. And you can actually create a theory explaining why this happened, or what is going on. So it's an interesting way to do a study. It is a little more intensive in that you're doing rounds of interviews, and throughout the interviews, you are analyzing your data. Now, the thing to remember with the analysis, it's called constant comparison, because you are constantly going in and you are comparing the old data to the new data, the old data to itself, the new data to the middle data. You have 3 levels of analysis you're going to be doing with this. The nice thing about the ground theory analysis, it's very straightforward. You do your coding, and you create your codes. You take those codes, you organize them into groups. You take those groups, you reduce them down, see how they connect, and you get your themes. And then you take your themes and use them to create your theory. So it's a straightforward process, but it is a more intensive process. So let's talk about collecting data and how you do it. In qualitative studies, interviews and questionnaires, focus groups, documents, and observations, again, are the most popular methods to use. There are lots of new things coming out, especially with the internet. I've seen people analyze web pages. I've seen people do analysis of social media. There's a lot of places to collect data these days. The traditional and most used is, of course, interviews. This is the heart of your study. This is where you should be really spending your time in thinking about your research questions, in designing the interview questions that will get you the data you need, practicing your interviewing skills, and conducting those interviews. I can't tell you enough, do not rush your interviews. This is the heart of the information you're going to need. When you're doing an interview, you want to do less talking. You want your participant to be talking pretty much nonstop, and you're just sort of putting a word or two in to keep them going. Questionnaires can be helpful. One of the issues you can have with questionnaires is that a lot of times they're a little more closed-ended, so they're very structured. People don't necessarily, they're filling things out. And when people write, a lot of times they don't write the way they talk. So you could ask someone, tell me why you like ice cream, and they'll go on for 15 minutes. And you say, write me an essay about why you like ice cream, and you'll get 3 sentences. So, because a lot of people don't like writing or they're not comfortable writing. On the other hand, if you're dealing with a sensitive topic and you're careful in your selection of your participants, you can get a lot of information through writing. Because maybe something people are uncomfortable at talking about, but they might be willing to write about. So you need to weigh what kind of data you're looking for and what you're trying to get at. Focus groups are an amazing way to get data. You have to have a lot of skill to run a focus group. You never want more than 6 to 8 participants. If you get larger than that, people get lost. You have someone take over the conversation, and as a moderator, it's hard for you to make sure everyone's talking. Focus group, 90 minutes is the longest you want it to go, or you're going to lose people after that. Never, never, never ask more than 10 questions. Because think about it, you have, let's say, 6 people. If they each spend 5 minutes answering a question, you're going hours. So you want very, very directed questions. You want to be really careful. They have to be open-ended, but at the same time, you want to make sure they're sort of narrow so you're getting the information you need. The other thing that you can do in focus groups that can start conversation or help is have some either-or questions to start with. Like, give them a list of 3 things. Do you like vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry ice cream? 2 people like chocolate. The rest like vanilla, and no one likes strawberry. Well, why does anyone like strawberry? And you can get them all talking about why they don't like strawberry. The other piece that's really important in the focus group is at the beginning to conduct an introduction, to set up some ground rules for the group if you don't want people interrupting each other or talking over each other. And at the end, wrapping up what was said, sort of summarizing what you've learned and checking in with that group to say, sort of what I'm seeing, is this sort of an accurate representation of what you guys have been telling me? So again, with a focus group, you've got to have a lot of control. You've got to be comfortable talking in front of a group of people, and you've got to really think out your questions. Documents can be anything. If it's written, you can analyze it. Anything from a menu to someone's diary to a web page, government documents, whatever data you want. If it's in written form, it's usable in a qualitative study. Observations. Observations are when you are sitting, doing the interview, you may be observing somebody and taking notes on how they're acting. The other piece might be, let's say you're doing a study of kindergarten teachers, and you're observing them in a classroom, and you're going to spend a half an hour in that classroom just noting down every single thing they do so you can analyze it later. So these are all different pieces of data that you can gather that can help you create a study and really give you some rich and thick information so that your study has some depth and breadth. Okay, transcribing data. I'll be the first person to tell you, I don't like transcribing. It's hard for me. I believe in letting somebody else do it. But if you're going to do it, be in a quiet place. Close the door. Be willing to stop and start whatever recording you have. There's a lot of software out there that you can use to like speed up and slow down. Some of it's free on the internet. I'm not going to recommend one because I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. So you can do it, transcription and do it. Make sure that when you're transcribing at the top of each page, you have the time, setting, participant identification, and session type. Like if you're doing focus groups and interviews, you want to say interview. Make sure your pages are numbered so they're in order. Have wide margins because you may want to take notes while you're reading through your transcript. Make sure you're clearly distinguishing between speakers. A couple ways to do that. One is, you can say researcher, participant, or you can color code. Anything the researcher you say is red, anything the participant says is green. However works for you, you just want to be able to tell the difference between people. You clearly want to identify which questions are interview or survey questions in there, bold them or whatever. The reason you want to do this is if you're going to end up using a computer program to help you analyze data, you may want to cut those out of the interviews when you're running different reports because otherwise it'll pull it up as data and say that, okay, you had 25 people say the word data when only 5 people said it, but it was in each interview question. So it can skew your results when you're analyzing using a computer. Make note of noises. If people paused, if you couldn't tell what they said, if they were laughing, they were crying, someone came in the middle of the interview, all that stuff should be in your transcription. The more detail you have in there, the better your long-term analysis is going to be. So organizing data. Bunch of ways to do this. First of all, find, if you don't have a file cabinet that's lockable, get one. Your data, out of respect for your participants, you want to protect their confidentiality. So anything connected with the interview should be, or with the study, really, should be kept under lock and key. If you're going to have computerized data like Word files, I would not recommend saving on a computer. Some people do. I would recommend having a thumb drive or an external drive and keep all your data on there. That way you can take that, you can lock that up with any paper copies you have and keep it in a file cabinet. Okay? You group your data together. You can figure out what works for you. You can do it by the type of documents you have, all by participant, by location, by data source. Here's the one exception. If you're talking about, let's say, a very sensitive subject, for example, I've worked on a study in the past where my friend, when I was in grad school, was dealing with kids who committed crimes. And we want to be really careful because we were interviewing their parents that they don't feel like, because they're talking about things that their children did they're not necessarily proud of. So we assigned everyone a pseudonym. When they signed the informed consent to participate in the study, they signed it with their real name. That informed consent was kept separately and locked up separately from the data. So if for some reason, heaven forbid, someone got a hold of the data, they still couldn't tell who their people were because everything was identified by pseudonym. So that's the one place where you may want to separate if you're trying to protect confidentiality, but remember, everything needs to be locked up. Be systematic in your file naming. So let's say you have 12 participants and you have 12 Word documents. What I generally do is, I might say it's participant 1, the date the interview happened, and then what pseudonym I'm using to write them up. So participant 1, 7/7/17, Patrick. Participant 2, 7/8/17, John. And so I know exactly what it is. And having learned the hard way, always, always, always back up everything you have. If it's paper, Xerox it. If it's data or digital files, make 2 copies of it. Name them different things. keep them on different thumb drives. I have learned the hard way. It's not fun when you lose like a computer file and you've spent 5 hours coding. So always make sure that in your worst case scenario that you have a backup of what you've done. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to analyze data. I'm a kind of old-fashioned girl. I love analyzing data by hand. I do a lot of computer analysis, but there's something about going through data by hand, especially when you have a small amount of data, like you've interviewed 4 people or 5 people. You use hard copies of your data. You organize it on the file. You use your margins for taking notes. I color code. So every time I come to a different code, I color it a different color. I have a set of like 50 colored markers. And I sprawl notes. I cut my interviews apart, and I put them in piles. Sometimes physically moving stuff around, but you see things you might not have seen before. But it really is, when you're analyzing by hand, it's reading through, it's starting to identify your different pieces of code, highlighting it in some way so you know what it means, giving it a name, and then analyzing it. It can take, it's really interesting. This part for sometimes can take more time, sometimes it takes less time. I think it's very individual, and it's up to who you are and how your mind works. Everyone's brain works a little differently. If you're a really hands-on kind of person, you may want to do it this way because it feeds to your strength. Okay, so analyzing data with computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, CAQDAS, as people say. There are some real advantages to using software programs. There's some real power in using these programs. One of the things I can tell you is no program will really analyze the data for you. That is still your job to do, your strength, your brain. What computer programs can do is help you organize and manage your data. So generally what you will do is you will transcribe your interviews. You will upload them into the computer program. Once they're uploaded, they're your sources. And from there, you can start going through and highlight and code. It's literally the point-and-click, highlight, assign a code for most of the programs. A couple of strengths that really happens when you use computer programs. You can sort your data. You can assign labels or codes. You can search your data. It's super powerful. I typically use in vivo. I also use hyper-research quite a bit. Those are the two that I use the most. One of the nice things you can do with in vivo is you can run reports of different types. One of the reports that I run a lot is I do a most commonly used word search. I look for the 50 most commonly used words. Sometimes I can tell you a lot because you may miss something without realizing that that word has come up again and again and again. You can also use a search for specific words. Let's say you were studying nursing students and you were trying to figure out what type of entertainment they did to relax. A lot of times I'll put in words associated with like party, relax, meditate, whatever may have come up to see how many, because it'll pull and tell you how many people said it. Here's the one caveat, and here's a mistake a lot of students make when they use these types of programs. You cannot put all of your interviews into one Word file, because according to the computer, you have one interview and one source. So each interview needs to be in a separate file, so it's like a separate person, so the computer can count it. Because if it's not, and I run that test, it's going to come back and tell me 25 people use the word relax. I mean, there are 25 incidents of the word relax. One person said that because it has one file. Versus it has 50 files, and it's telling me on my 50 files, 25 people or 25 sources use the word relax. So that's something that's super important. So you have to be very organized when you're uploading your information. Again, be very detailed in labeling. When you're putting those files in, you want to be able to identify who that file belongs to. So I always fall back to my participant 1, date of the interview, pseudonym I'm using, so that I can see who said what. Now, another real strength that you can do is a lot of these programs will let you produce different charts or graphs to see trends or patterns in your data that you may not just see visually looking at it. or that you may, but it might take you longer if you're looking at paper. Now, I can tell you the programs are pretty effective. Most of them have a 1-month free trial for you to use them. So if it's a computer program you're going to want to use, but you don't necessarily want to buy the program forever, be very specific. Don't download that program until you're ready to start doing data and know you have a month or whatever the trial period is for that data to get the data analyzed. I know that some of these programs, especially I know in Vivo, you can export your information to Word or Excel files. So even if you don't have the program, you'll still have access to your data and how it was organized. So there's a lot, pluses and minuses. What I would recommend is if you're going to use a computer-assisted data analysis software, look at the different types, see what works for you. I do find NVivo to be the most user-friendly. So let's talk about the actual process of coding. So here's some data I have. And it says, I wasn't really happy with the outcome. I almost started to cry when I found out. I had worked so hard to get a good grade, excuse the typo, in the class. I felt bad that all my hard work, sorry, another one, was for nothing. I knew that this would have a big impact on my GPA. I had to go and get myself together before anyone from class saw me. I didn't want them asking why I was misty-eyed all of a sudden. Now you've caught one thing that happens, and this is going to happen to you. You or your transcriptionist will have typos in your data. Be very careful when you correct a typo. You have to be sure that it truly was a typo, because sometimes people will use the wrong word. So you have to sit there and either listen to your recording again to make sure that they actually said work instead of walk, or grade instead of frayed. Because if they didn't, you have to use their words. You can make an explanation for it, saying this is what the person actually said by putting the correct word in parentheses or putting SIC, sick. But it's really important to know that before you change a word, you need to double check your interviews. So I've read through this. I've read through it 7 times. The things that have jumped out to me: wasn't happy, started to cry, felt bad, misty-eyed. And also, for me, get myself together is another one. So these are all codes. So I would put wasn't happy, felt bad, disappointment, started to cry, misty-eyed, tearfulness. Those 2 feed in, and they become a theme of sadness. Now there are other things in this excerpt that I haven't for you, but I'm going, I had worked so hard. My hard work was for nothing. Okay? So they're telling you right there, there's a possible theme coming out of there about the effort made, or it could be hard work. The other thing you can look at is there's a whole sentence there that describes the consequence of this. So I knew that this would have a big impact on my GPA. I had to get myself together. Those are the impacts. I didn't want people to see me. I didn't want them asking, trying to hide. So you can see that I've suddenly come up with, in that small piece of data, 3 or 4 different possible themes, definitely I'd say about 6 to 10 different codes. So that's one reason you're going to read and reread and reread this data, because it's important to catch the nuances that are there. Okay? So the coded process began with me reading this several times. You can see as I started isolating specific pieces of text. We labeled some of them, disappointment and tearfulness. Then we refined them so we wouldn't have anything really redundant, and said, okay, this fits together. It's going to fall under the theme sadness. Now sadness might be, in the end, a sub-theme. It might be, the overall theme might be, failure. And under that, future impact might be one theme. Sadness might be one theme. Reaction to failure might be one theme. You're going to start looking at all those nuances to get as much information as you can from the data that you have in front of you. So how do you put your findings together? There's a couple of different ways. The most common way to report qualitative data is in narrative form. So you write up what you've learned. You support what you've learned using excerpts from the data. So I was studying that, we were talking about grades a minute ago. So the theme was sadness. So I might say, students who reported failing in classes felt deep levels of sadness. Participant 1 stated, I was misty-eyed, quote. Participant 2 stated, I hung my head. And you weave this together. You're trying to make a story so that whoever's reading this can understand exactly how you got to that theme and what the participants are saying. You can have comparison tables where you're laying out the data so people can compare them in a table format. You don't see that as often. Typically, tables, when I do analysis, I use them to maybe show a list of codes, show the demographic tables that you see in the bottom, so the data about the participants themselves. Diagrams happen. Especially if you're studying a process, you may want to diagram how A and B led to C and where the shortcuts or the long ways around were. Maps, you can do word maps, connections, figures. Now figures are really popular in qualitative data. It's a way to visually represent what you've learned in the study and what the connections are, because figures can come in a variety of different directions and display different things. One of the things I will tell you, the best way to do figures is use Word. There's a function in Word where it gives you interactive, you can create interactive figures. It's the best way to do it. They're preset. You can use them. You can change the color to black and white like you would need for APA. And it's all set up with text. All you have to do is type it in and it appears. So, really investigate the power you have in Word to create some of the stuff. Okay, so reporting findings in narrative form. As I said, it's the main way to report in most qualitative research designs. You're going to have supportive excerpts from your transcript. You're going to try to have multiple perspectives. So you don't just base a theme on one person. You're going to have negative case examples. I do studies where 4 people said A, and then 1 person said X. Well, that's normal. That's going to happen in any human experience, but you want to report it. So, as you can see, we have 2 examples: environmental factors. And he's saying 11 students in the file noted that their eating habits were due to environmental factors. And they talk about student 1 that the perception of rice is a norm. Their quote was, we always had rice in the house, my mom, my uncle. You can see the and is there because the student didn't say and. So they put that in there to make it clear, and they put it in brackets so you would understand that order is inserted. Everyone else I knew just ate rice. That's how I was brought up, and we eat it every day. Student 3 said something similar and talked about his Hispanic heritage. Student 2 spoke about eating habits due to religious affiliation. So you can see everyone sort of agreed, and they're talking, but they're different environmental factors. It's religion, it's culture, it's race, all along, but they're all factors that surround them, so you can make that to a theme. Then the next one is coping mechanisms. And they're saying 3 students indicated using food as a tool to help them cope, manage, and deal with stress. We've all heard about stress eating. I know I've done it. I know lots of people who do it. So these 3 students are saying, like student 2 said, I'm going to run to food when my parents argue, and put a quote there. I see them fight. I felt useless, so I ate to shut it out. Okay? And like I said, 2 other students said that. However, student 1 had a different take on this. So that's your disproving case or negative case example. I hated food. The idea of it made me sick. My friend used to say I was letting him, the boyfriend, so we can clarify, take control. So you can see, rather than using it as a coping method for this one student, it was almost the enemy. And it almost made it strong, the entire theme stronger, because you can say, wow, most people will do this, but there's a couple people that we need to be aware that will do the opposite. Okay, so reporting findings for grounded theory. This is one way you can report findings in grounded theory. You can do it as a narrative, or you can do it like this. And you can do it for other types of qualitative. I tend to find narratives more powerful and more engaging. But this is not wrong. what you do is you put the interview question, you talk about your coding process, you give a brief description of what was going on, and then you make a table. And you can see it's a study on feeding. The participant numbers are on the far left-hand corner, and the themes that they had are level of difficulty, planning, type of food. And then they gave the actual pieces of data that supported each theme. So it's sort of like a table visually, just like this is what it is. Then what they did was, that was their first step, that's open coding. Axial coding is the second step. That's where they actually created themes. So they're saying what they found was there were two thematic relationships, and they put percentages to it. Again, this is not necessarily what everybody does, but it's a way of doing it. 5 of the 10 or 50% had mixed experiences. 3 of the 10 had plans or strategizing. And then the selective coding for interview question 1 is giving you sort of the overall experience. And it's telling you which quotes they found were most significant. So it's not as story-like necessarily, but it still gives you a really good glimpse of what people are saying, and it can give you a very clear way to show your actual data analysis process. What are the steps? Someone can look at this and say, okay, I know exactly how they coded their data, how they got to their conclusion. So this is a little closer view so you can see it. But you can see under level of difficulty, participant 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8, and 10 were all in that one theme. Then planning, we had 3, participant 1, 4, and 7. And then type of food, just 1 participant. Okay. And again, here's a little close-up of the axial coding, which is the second step, where they're grouping things. And the selective coding, where they're talking about, they're describing the process or the experiences of feeding twins, and they're saying it's a mixed experience. That's their theory, is that there's not necessarily one straight truth everyone has. It's sort of mixed for people. Trustworthiness. Okay, this is where people can get confused sometimes. I know you go through grad school and you hear all about reliability and validity and how important that is in studies. For qualitative studies, we don't look at reliability and validity. We're not doing statistical measures. What we are looking at are issues of trustworthiness. These are the criteria that people who read your study will use to evaluate how accurate your results are. You know, can they trust the results? Is the data good? Is the information good? So, credibility. How true are the findings? So how accurate are they? Do they reflect what the participants actually said? One of the things you're going to do here, or to ensure this, is make sure that you have good interviews with thick, rich data. Here's a place where you can use triangulation. Triangulation is when you use different types of data to compare to each other, such as a case study, where you compare interviews to each other, or you use different methods. You analyze your data in a couple of different ways and show that you still come up with the same results. Transferability. Here's the thing. When it comes to qualitative research, you don't have to necessarily have transferability. Transferability is in the eye of the person who's reading your study. It's up to them to judge whether this information that they have, based on what they know about their own population, could it be applied. There are things you can do to enhance this. And I'm going to go back to thick and rich description. The more information you have from your participants, the better you describe your sample, the better you describe your setting, the more information you give to someone who's reading your study, the more they can determine whether this information can transfer to a different setting. Dependability. Can the study and findings be replicated? This is where your field notes and your audit trails are going to come in. You have to record everything you do in a level of detail that is so minute, isn't the wrong word, but that's so detailed that someone could come in, never talk to you, read what you've done, and copy your study. So that's where dependability comes in. That's where your field notes and your meticulous attention to detail comes in. Confirmability. How free are the results from research bias? So when you're doing qualitative research, one of the things to remember is you have to focus on the real role of the researcher. In qualitative research, the researcher is considered an instrument. Think about it. every bit of data, every decision, every thought is flowing through you. You're determining the research questions. You're determining the interview questions. You're doing the interviews. You're analyzing the data. You're transcribing the data. You're writing up the results. You touch everything. So one of the things that you really need to do is figure out what your stance is. If you're doing a phenomenological study or a generic qualitative study, you may engage in bracketing, which is where you sit down and I recommend write down all of your thoughts, ideas, biases, and presuppositions about the population. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think about these people? What do you think about the situation? And really look at that. Understand what they are so that when you're looking at the data, you can say, okay, this is my viewpoint. I need to make sure that I'm not pulling it into what I'm doing. You can interview the interviewer. I recommend this. It's one of the things I did for my studies when I was in school, where I actually had a fellow grad student interview me using my interview questions, and I answered all the questions, and we analyzed the data to see what were my true feelings about whatever it was I was studying. The other thing you can do is hire someone from the outside to actually do your analysis part, so that you know that there's someone, whether it's a statistician or, for us, a qualitative analyst, who will go through, analyze your data, and then you use your results to write up everything, because that way you know that they don't necessarily have any biases. So there's a variety of different ways that you can go about to actually try to eliminate bias. On the other hand, if you think it's important what you think, and being a researcher, that what you think affects your research, think about doing research from a feminist point of view. Feminist research methods feel that the researcher is an integral part of the researcher, and what they bring into the study is just as important as what the participants bring in. This also happens quite a bit in interpretive phenomenological analysis, IPA. It's a great method. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there because it's a little complex to explain. There's tons of articles on it. So if it's something where you feel like what you're bringing to the study is very important, take a look at feminist research methods, take a look at interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA. So things that you have to be careful about. Your study design. Make sure that whatever design you choose matches your research question. Make sure you've got a focus to your study. Make sure you've defined the phenomenon that you're going to be examining. Data collection, not achieving saturation. Saturation is a little foggy term sometimes. To me, the best of it is, once you've hit, let's say, 6 interviews, you start paying attention. And if you do another 3 interviews and no new data, no new codes come out of it, you've reached saturation. What it means is, as you're going on your interviews and you're interviewing people, suddenly you realize you're not learning anything new. People are saying the same thing over and over again. That means you've reached saturation. Typically, based on some of the research that's out there, the round number is once you've done 3 interviews in a row and new information has come up, you can say you've reached saturation. Interview design. I see this all the time. Don't ask interview questions that don't apply to your research question. You're going to end up with data that's not applicable. You may have a ton of data, but you can't use it. Leading interview questions. Don't ask, so don't you think those Steelers are a really good team? That's a leading interview question. Versus, what football team do you think is the best? See the difference? I'm asking them pretty much the same thing, but I'm not trying to direct them to tell me that the Steelers are the best team. Finally, data analysis and interpretation. Don't be superficial. This is where you need to spend the majority of your time after the interview, is going through your data again and again and again, combing through and twisting it, turning it, analyzing it, and spending the time to make sure you're getting every bit of information you can out of it. So that's our overview of qualitative research. I've enjoyed speaking to you guys tonight. If you have questions that come up after the study, feel free to send us an email, and we will absolutely answer them. So we do have a couple questions here. I see Majid wants to know, does QDA software hinder or impact the process of analytical results in relation to theory? No, I don't think it does. Here's what happens is you're going to, when you're analyzing your data, you're always going to have your theory in your mind. That's one of the important things. You have the power to name your results or weave your theory in. And you have the power to, like, especially with in vivo, you can make memos. I do that all the time on each interview where I might put notes saying, you know, this really connects to the conceptual framework of this study, and maybe put a couple reasons why. You can pull in articles and say, okay, you can actually connect those articles, save them in vivo, and say, this theme actually proves what this article says, and do a linked connection so that when you're writing the analysis up, it's already in there for you. Charles wanted to know if I could provide advice on conducting an interview when the use of a recorder is not authorized. This is tough, but people used to do it. You need to take very specific notes. You need to be willing to ask your participant if they, if they're saying a lot, repeat back to them what you heard. If that's what they said, then write it down while you're saying it back to them. Give them an opportunity to clarify. One of the things that's really important when you're not using a recorder, whatever notes you're taking about what they're saying in the interview, you need to make sure that you give them a copy of that transcript so they can say, yes, this is accurate, no, that's not accurate. And also that you're verbally checking in. This is what I just wrote down, what I understand you said. Is that what you meant, or did I get something wrong? Frequent check-ins, you're going to have a sore hand. Some people who are fast typists will type rather than handwrite. It's going to depend on where you're more comfortable. The one thing I think with typing that can get in the way is you're behind a computer screen. So it's hard to have face-to-face interaction versus sitting with a pad of paper and writing. But just on here, you're going to take very, very detailed notes and write really carefully what they're saying and constantly check in with what they're saying. Now, the other thing that I didn't mention earlier when I talked about issues of trustworthiness, but that's important to remember, is member checking. People get confused. There is transcript review and there's member checking. Transcript review is when you do your transcript, whether it's handwritten notes or a typed interview, and you have the participants read their interview and say, yeah, that's the way I feel comfortable with that. Member checking is different, and people confuse the two. Member checking is when you write up like a summary of your results. Well, let's say you create a figure that describes the experience. You take the figure with a summary. You have your participants look at it and say, yeah, I think this is an accurate representation of what was actually happening. Or no, it wasn't. This is why. So trying to mix those two up because it happens all the time. So Adrian wanted to know, how would we go about using in vivo for expensive design? You wouldn't. Well, you do, but here's what you do, is you do your qualitative data in vivo, you do your quantitative data in SPSS, you can pull the results into in vivo and attach it like a separate document to the qualitative. But in vivo will not do any of the statistical analysis for you. Any other questions? So let me get to, just so you guys know, we've got a webinar coming up next month on Friday, July 15th at 7:30. It's going to be with Crystal Miller. She is awesome at what she does. I ask her questions all the time. And she's going to tell you how to navigate and work on your literature review and ways to save time and ways to really get through it. She's really, really good at this. I can't recommend enough that you attend. Thank you for being here tonight. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to email us at Statistics Solutions, and we'd be happy to answer any kind of questions that may come up after. Because I know sometimes you're at a webinar and you're thinking, and then the next day, oh, I wish I'd asked that. It's okay to do that. Just give us an email, and we'll get an answer back to you. So have a good night.